The live stream wasn't supposed to be emotional. It wasn't supposed to be heavy. It was meant to clear the air, to answer a few questions, maybe calm the noise that had been building online, but instead, it became something else entirely, a mirror reflecting the heartbreak, confusion, and exhaustion that has followed the Whittaker family for months when the stream began. It looked ordinary Patrick sitting in his familiar spot. His voice steady but worn, the internet connection flickered in and out. But through the distortion, a familiar tone came through, weary compassion. What started as a technical issue soon turned into something symbolic. The breaking signal mirrored the fragmentation within the family itself, cracks that had deepened far beyond the reach of any camera Patrick had intended. To review 2 videos he'd posted earlier that day on his Facebook page, they were updates, simple check-ins meant to show the family supporters that things were moving forward, that there was still hope, but the live stream malfunctioned, splitting into 3 segments. The first clear, the second unstable, the third quieter and more intimate by the time Betty appeared on screen in the second video. Viewers noticed something that words couldn't disguise. Her face told a story of grief and fatigue. She wasn't the woman from the early interviews, the one who, despite hardship, smiled through the noise. This Betty seemed smaller somehow, as though the weight of recent weeks had pressed down on her spirit. The chat filled instantly. "She looks tired. Is she okay? What's going on?" It was clear. Betty was in a bad place emotionally. Those watching could see it, feel it, and sense that something far deeper was happening off camera for months. The family had been at the center of a storm, rumors, accusations, questions about money, custody, and control at first. It was just curiosity from followers. Then came the divisions. People began to take sides. Team Patrick, Team Eric, or those who claimed neutrality but couldn't resist judging from the sidelines. The truth is, nobody outside the inner circle fully knew what was happening. What was once a heartwarming portrait of resilience had turned into an ongoing digital dispute about money, loyalty, and guardianship. When the live stream froze midway, Patrick's voice cut out right after he said, "Betty's been through a lot, you can see it," for a few seconds. There was only static. It was a moment that said more than the broadcast itself ever could. The weight of public scrutiny every time the Whittaker name appeared online. It carried both fascination and tension. Supporters prayed for them. Critics speculated endlessly about them. What had once been a symbol of family endurance had become a public tug of war over narratives. Patrick had faced accusations. Eric had faced backlash, and Betty, caught in the middle, had become the emotional core of the saga. Everyone spoke about her, but few spoke to her. So when she appeared on that broken live stream, it felt like an accidental confession. Her silence was full of meaning. Her eyes spoke the language of someone who had carried too much responsibility for too long. According to Patrick, Betty had told him that the money had always been controlled by Eric, not him. "Patrick hasn't taken a dime," she had said. Her tone wasn't defensive, it was tired, as if she was simply stating a fact. She no longer wanted to defend. Patrick explained that he had only ever managed one account, his personal Facebook page, and that he had used it to help the family whenever he could. But online, truth is often irrelevant. Once the story takes shape, people believe what aligns with their emotions, not necessarily with evidence. And while Patrick tried to clarify things, the bigger story had already written itself, another public unraveling of a private struggle. The condemned home. Perhaps one of the most haunting revelations came when Patrick mentioned the family home had been condemned not for drama, not for headlines, but for something painfully practical. The house, it turned out, had no septic system. Wastewater from the bathroom ran directly into a nearby creek. Too many watching. It was shocking to those who had followed the family's journey closely. It was simply heartbreaking. This was not just about a home being closed off. It was about dignity being taken away. Authorities had reportedly deemed the property unlivable, and the family could no longer return. The place that once represented survival now stood as a silent monument to loss. Patrick said they were trying to work through legal channels to find solutions, that they'd even seen an attorney earlier that day. But even in his attempt to sound hopeful, there was a heaviness to his tone. He was trying to be strong for an audience that wanted reassurance. Yet the truth was clear. Everything about this situation was fragile. The home wasn't. The only thing falling apart, the relationships around it were. To the blame game, much of the online discourse had turned toxic. People demanded to know who was in control, who had the money, who was exploiting whom. Was Patrick sincere? Was Eric manipulative? Was Betty complicit or victimized? Everyone had an opinion, and the noise became deafening. Patrick, visibly exhausted during his stream, said it plainly. I don't care if they go to jail. I don't care if they don't. I just care that the Whittakers are taken care of. He said it not as a statement of indifference, but of desperation. His voice cracked slightly, just enough for those watching to feel it. The drama had reached a point where the well-being of the family was buried beneath gossip, and outraged viewers wanted justice. But what the family needed was peace. The human behind the headlines that night. Patrick also spoke about the pain of seeing Betty under pressure. She wasn't just worried. She was broken. The family had been displaced, their home condemned, and their name debated by strangers online. In one of the quieter moments of the video, he mentioned something that lingered with everyone who watched: Betty's lifelong promise when she was only 14. She had promised her mother that she would take care of her brothers and sisters for the rest of her life. Decades later, that promise still defined her, even as her body aged, even as her strength faded. She kept trying. It wasn't just a duty, it was her identity. That promise is what made her pain visible now. The family separation wasn't only physical. It was emotional, spiritual. She had given her life to holding them together, and now everything she'd held on to was slipping through her fingers. Viewers saw it in her trembling hands, her distant eyes. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was heartbreak. The internet's double-edged sword. Patrick's words near the end of the video cut through the noise. We can get along in this world. We don't have to disagree with each other all the time, and when we do, we don't have to be nasty about it. He wasn't just talking about the commenters. He was talking about the culture of online cruelty that had grown around the Whittaker story. How easy it is to judge someone's pain from behind a keyboard. How quickly empathy evaporates in the glare of digital spectacle. The Whittakers didn't ask to become content. They didn't sign up for viral fame or public pity. Their story began with a journalist's documentary, a window into a family surviving despite unimaginable hardship. But once the world saw that window, it refused to close it. Now, years later, they lived with the shadow of that attention, every smile analyzed, every action questioned, every word dissected. And yet, through it all, one truth remains: they are still a family, flawed, fractured, but deeply bound by something that predates fame, the simple need to stay together, a prayer for healing. As Patrick closed the live stream, he spoke softly. Pray for the Whittakers. He said, they need your prayers tonight. It was more than a plea. It was a confession that all the talking, arguing, and streaming in the world couldn't fix what only compassion could heal. He didn't say it dramatically. He said it tiredly, sincerely. After hours of defending, explaining, and clarifying, he returned to what mattered most: empathy in a world that profits from outrage. That moment felt like rebellion for the viewers who stayed until the end. The broken connection didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the glimpse of truth beneath the static, the realization that behind every rumor, every live stream, every debate, there are human beings struggling to find light through the noise. And somewhere off camera, in a quiet corner of West Virginia, a woman named Betty was still holding on to her promise to care, to protect, to endure. Her story wasn't over. It was simply changing shape. The night after the live stream, something unexpected happened. Instead of fading away, the video clips began to circulate again, reposted, re-edited, and shared with captions like "Betty's cry for help" or "Patrick finally speaks out." Within hours, the Whittaker family had once again become the centerpiece of a sprawling online conversation, part sympathy, part spectacle for those who had been following the family's story for years. This was familiar territory. The cycle was predictable now: a moment of vulnerability, an explosion of commentary, then a slow fade until the next event reignited the storm. But this time felt different. Betty's appearance wasn't just another update, it was a breaking point. Her eyes, her expression, Her silence, all of it, seemed to pull people out of the endless debate and back into the human core of the story yet. Even in that moment of empathy, the noise didn't stop, it only grew louder. The internet reacts across YouTube and Facebook. Creators began posting reaction videos within hours. Titles competed for clicks. The truth about the Whittakers. Patrick exposes Eric. Betty's breakdown, what you didn't see. Each one claimed to offer context, but few had any real information. Viewers from all sides filled the comment sections with speculation and emotion. Some blamed Patrick for putting Betty on camera in such a fragile state. Others defended him, saying the world needed to see how deeply this ordeal had hurt her. One commenter wrote, "It's not about sides anymore. It's about a woman who's breaking in front of millions while everyone else argues about who's right." That comment was liked thousands of times. It seemed to capture what many were feeling but didn't know how to express. The truth was, this family had become too public for their own protection. What started as an act of storytelling, an attempt to document life in its rawest form, had evolved into something darker. A digital battleground where empathy and exploitation blurred together. The price of exposure. By the next morning, local media outlets began to pick up fragments of the story. Social media uproar over Whittaker livestream. Read one headline. Another focused on the home being condemned, framing it as part of a larger crisis of rural poverty. But none of them grasped the emotional complexity of what was unfolding behind those headlines. Was a family that didn't just lose a home, they were losing the fragile boundaries between private pain and public curiosity. Betty's promise to take care of her brothers and sisters had become a lifelong chain. She had kept it faithfully, but now the world was watching her struggle to hold on. The irony was bitter. The same audience that once celebrated her strength now witnessed her exhaustion. Analyzing it for entertainment, even supporters were conflicted. Many genuinely wanted to help, sending donations or prayers, but others began questioning where that money went, who handled it, and whether any of it reached the family. That question, who controls the money, became the new centerpiece of controversy. Patrick tried to clarify during his follow-up posts that he only managed one account, his personal Facebook page, and that funds collected there were used directly for the family's needs. But online truth has little to do with facts. It's about perception, and once doubt sets in, it's almost impossible to erase Betty's silent burden. In the days that followed, Betty withdrew from view. The emotional toll was evident. People close to the situation described her as heartbroken, confused, and tired beyond words. Her identity had become intertwined with her responsibility for decades. She had been the caregiver, the matriarch, the anchor, but now that role seemed to be slipping away. The condemnation of the family home hit her hardest. For years, despite the poverty and isolation, that house represented more than shelter. It was memory, it was history. It was the promise she'd made to her mother, kept alive through every hardship. Losing it wasn't just a logistical issue. It was an emotional fracture, and now, displaced and uncertain, Betty found herself in front of cameras again, not as a storyteller, but as a symbol of struggle. A supporter commented, "You can see it in her face. She's carrying generations of pain, not just her own." Those words lingered in the threads of conversation like an echo, because deep down, everyone watching knew that what they were seeing wasn't about one family. It was about what happens when compassion becomes content. The psychology of public pain. Experts who had followed the Whittaker phenomenon began weighing in again. Psychologists spoke about compassion fatigue, a term describing how audiences constantly exposed to others' suffering online eventually become numb or desensitized. At first, viewers feel empathy, then they crave updates. Then, when the updates get repetitive, they demand more drama, and soon, they're no longer witnessing pain. They're consuming it. That's what had happened with the Whittakers. Their humanity was both their strength and their curse. The same vulnerability that drew millions to their story was now the very thing that left them exposed to judgment. Patrick, perhaps unknowingly, had become the lightning rod for that energy. In every live stream, every update, he carried the burden of representation, of speaking for a family that could know Longer speak for itself, but the internet doesn't forgive easily, even when intentions are pure. Misunderstandings multiply. The smallest misstep, a word, a glance, a rumor can set off a wave of condemnation. Rebuilding, trusting one of his later statements. Patrick said something that stood out. I have no dog in this fight. I just want to make sure they're okay. It was a simple sentence, but it carried the exhaustion of someone trying to navigate between truth and perception. His efforts to explain, to clarify, were drowned out by the constant noise of online interpretation. He insisted he wasn't on anyone's side, not Eric's, not his own, but people no longer listened in good faith. The digital audience had split into factions, each convinced they knew the real story. Meanwhile, Betty's health began to decline under the stress. Her hair visibly grayed, her skin lost its glow, and the fire in her eyes dimmed. The woman who once held a family together now seemed to be held together by sheer will. Supporters began to notice messages poured in, praying for Betty. She looked so tired. Someone please help this family. Yet, for all the empathy in those messages, there was still an uncomfortable truth. Every prayer came with a view count. Every comment came with engagement. The algorithm rewarded compassion as long as it kept people watching. The real tragedy at the heart of this story lies a paradox. The internet gave the Whittakers visibility, which brought them help, attention, and financial support, but that same visibility also stripped away their privacy, their peace, and eventually their sense of safety. For Betty, this wasn't fame, it was exposure. For Patrick, it wasn't attention, it was responsibility. And for Eric, it wasn't connection, it was chaos. They were all trapped in the same system, one where tragedy trends faster than truth, and pain becomes public property. Patrick once said during a quieter moment in his live broadcast, if you don't want to donate, don't, but don't turn this family's life into a circus. That plea went largely unheard because the world doesn't know how to look away. A glimpse of hope still. Not all was lost amid the chaos. Small acts of kindness began to appear. Local volunteers offered help to clean the condemned property. Others organized drives for clothing and supplies. A church group in Virginia offered to help the family relocate temporarily. These gestures, though small, reminded everyone that the story wasn't only about tragedy, it was about resilience. One supporter wrote, even through the noise, you can still see the heart of this family. They've been tested, but they're still here. That's what matters. The next planned live stream, according to Patrick, would focus not on blame but on healing. We're not here to fight. He said, we're here to rebuild. Whether the internet would allow that narrative shift was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, hope seemed to flicker again. What comes next? The Whittaker story continues to evolve, shaped by a world that can't stop watching and a family that keeps surviving. Every live stream, every statement, every silent moment becomes part of a larger mosaic, a portrait of endurance in an age that consumes vulnerability. Betty's pain had awakened something in people. It reminded them that behind the trending hashtags and endless speculation, there were still humans, fragile, imperfect, enduring, and perhaps, if the audience could remember that truth, there might still be a chance for redemption, not just for the Whittakers, but for everyone who ever confused empathy with entertainment, because somewhere deep beneath the noise, the family was still praying for peace. And this time, the world might finally be ready to listen after the live stream and its aftermath. The Whittaker story took a quieter, more painful turn. The noise online began to fade, but the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the sound of exhaustion. For the first time in months, Betty withdrew completely from the public eye. No live streams, no videos, no statements, just silence. But silence, for Betty, wasn't rest, it was grief, a promise that never ended. People who had met Betty over the years often said the same thing, that she had an unshakable strength, a steady gentleness that made her the center of the family's world. That strength came from a promise she made as a child, to take care of her brothers and sisters no matter what. She had made that vow at 14, standing beside her mother's bed, long before anyone thought the name Whittaker would mean anything beyond a quiet family in rural West Virginia. For decades, Betty lived that promise through poverty, through ridicule, through the quiet isolation of the Appalachian Mountains. She stayed, she cared, she protected. But now, as the cameras turned off and the headlines faded, That lifelong duty began to weigh on her in a new way. The family she had held together had been scattered, not by tragedy, but by attention. What had begun as a human interest story had turned into something she no longer recognized. Faith in the ruins when the family home was condemned. Betty's heart broke in a way few could see for outsiders. It was a legal matter, a structural issue, no septic tank, an environmental hazard, but for Betty, it was the loss of everything familiar. The house wasn't much, its walls worn, its rooms cramped, the smell of wood smoke clinging to every surface, but it had been theirs, a sanctuary built out of survival, patched together year after year by faith and persistence. Now it was gone in the weeks after the condemnation. Betty turned inward. Those close to her said she spent hours reading her old Bible. The one she'd had since she was a teenager. Pages were marked with verses about endurance, forgiveness, and mercy. Her favorite passage, written in faded ink on the inside cover, read, "Blessed are those who weep now, for they shall laugh." But she wasn't laughing anymore. When Patrick visited her after the incident, he described her as quiet but alert, still holding on, but tired. She spoke very little about the live stream, or the backlash, or the money. Her only concern was the family, where they would live, how they would eat, whether the people online still cared for them or had already moved on. The fractured circle. The Whittakers had always been close, but the public attention had fractured them. Eric and Patrick's disagreements over finances had spilled into public view, and the internet treated their feud like a drama series. Betty, who wanted nothing to do with the fighting, found herself in the middle. She never wanted sides, only peace, but peace doesn't trend behind closed doors. She tried to mediate. She spoke with both men, reminding them of what mattered, the family's unity. Not online followers or donations, but her voice was small against the noise of public opinion. And the damage had already been done. Each man believed he was doing the right thing. Each believed he was protecting the family in his own way, and caught between them, Betty bore the emotional costs for the first time in her life. She felt helpless, watching her promise unravel in a world that didn't understand the kind of loyalty she lived by. A life under glass. The cameras had once seemed harmless. Years ago, when the first documentary about the Whittakers aired, people saw a family living with simplicity and strength. There was curiosity, yes, but also admiration. Now, that fascination had turned invasive. Betty's grief was analyzed frame by frame. Every expression, every sigh became content. Supporters said they wanted updates to make sure she was okay, but every update only deepened her exhaustion. In one private conversation, she reportedly said, "They say they love us, but they don't see what this has done to us." Those words summed up everything. The internet had given the family visibility, but it had taken their privacy, and with it, their peace. Patrick's return. Patrick continued posting occasional updates. His tone had softened. Gone were the defensive explanations, the clarifications about money and rumors. What replaced them were quiet appeals for prayer, compassion, and patience. He spoke of Betty with deep respect, calling her the backbone of the family, and asked viewers to keep her in your thoughts. But even he admitted that he didn't know what the future held. The home was gone, the legal situation was tangled, and the family's health, emotional, spiritual, physical, was fragile. There was a heaviness in every update, a feeling that something sacred had been broken and couldn't quite be repaired. The struggle to heal behind the scenes. A few kind souls stepped in. A small church in Virginia helped coordinate food deliveries. A local attorney offered pro bono advice about housing rights, and dozens of supporters quietly mailed letters of encouragement. Not donations, just words. Betty read every one of them. "Some people really do care," she said softly one afternoon, her eyes tired but kind. "I can feel it." Those letters, simple as they were, reminded her that humanity still existed beyond the chaos of the web. But her recovery wasn't linear. Some days she prayed and found peace. Other days she cried for hours. The pain of seeing her family displaced again cut deep, and though she rarely said it out loud, she worried that the world had already moved on. The weight of love. Betty's story is not just about loss, it's about endurance. It's about a woman who made a promise to love beyond reason, and who kept it even when love meant suffering. For all the noise, all the accusations, all the online debates, The truth remains painfully simple. Betty's only goal has ever been to protect her family even now. As her body grows frail and her spirit weary, she holds to that same vow made all those years ago in a small house in West Virginia. The world might see her as a symbol, a viral figure, a subject of documentaries, a trending topic, but to those who know her, she's something much more profound, a testimony to faith in its purest form. She has no speeches, number platforms, no need for recognition. Her story lives in the quiet moments, in her prayers whispered through tears, in her hands that have built, fed, and comforted for decades. And though the cameras have gone, Betty's promise endures. By the time the digital noise surrounding the Whittakers began to fade, something unexpected had taken its place. Silence, not the silence of neglect or disinterest, but the silence that comes when people finally start listening. Instead of talking weeks after the live stream that had reignited global attention on the family, the story seemed to recede into the background of the internet, replaced by new controversies, new faces, new fleeting dramas. But for the Whittakers, life did not move on so easily. The aftermath of fame lingers long after the spotlight shifts. For Betty, each day now begins quietly. There are no cameras, no interviews, no messages flashing across a phone, only the sound of birds at dawn and the slow rhythm of a woman rebuilding her strength. She has learned to cherish silence again. The story of the Whittaker family was never meant to be told in endless fragments online. It was meant to be understood, a story about endurance, faith, and the cost of exposure. And as the months passed after that emotional live stream, the true recovery of the family began, not in front of an audience, but within the fragile walls of their private lives. The slow return to peace. Patrick, once the loudest voice defending the family, gradually stepped back from the public stage. His updates became less frequent, his tone more measured. The days of long live streams and emotional explanations gave way to shorter messages of reflection, gratitude, forgiveness, healing. He admitted in one of his final updates that the constant scrutiny had taken a toll not only on the family but on himself. Sometimes, he said softly, you try so hard to tell the truth that you stop living it. Those words resonated deeply. It was a reminder that the line between documenting and living had become blurred for everyone involved behind the scenes. Patrick continued to visit Betty, helping with errands, sitting with her through long evenings, sometimes saying nothing at all. The woman who had once held an entire family together was now learning to be cared for. And that, for someone as selfless as Betty, was its own act of humility. The family had relocated temporarily with help from community members and a small circle of local supporters. The new home was modest, but it was safe. It had heat, running water, and peace, luxuries that often go unnoticed until they're gone. It wasn't much, but it was enough for echoes of compassion. As weeks turned into months, letters continued to arrive. Some came from other families who had faced the same type of unwanted attention, parents whose children had gone viral, or small-town residents who'd found themselves thrust into the chaos of the internet. They wrote about how their lives had changed, how fame had both given and taken away. One letter, written in shaky penmanship, read, your story reminded me to pray again. It reminded me that hardship doesn't mean abandonment. God still sees us, even when the world just watches. Betty read that letter 3 times before folding it neatly into her Bible. She never spoke much about herself, but that message, the idea that suffering can still carry purpose, seemed to give her quiet strength. And for many watching from afar, that strength was the most powerful message the Whittakers could offer. Even in their silence, they continued to teach the media's fading gaze. By late 2025, interest in the Whittaker case had dwindled. The headlines grew fewer, and the constant chatter on social platforms quieted down. For once, the internet seemed to let go. But for those who had truly followed the story, what lingered wasn't the spectacle, it was the humanity. Viewers who once tuned in for updates found themselves reflecting instead on what it means to witness pain responsibly. The documentary footage, which had once been seen as shocking or curious, took on new meaning. The rawness that had once drawn millions now felt sacred, a reminder of what it means to see people not as content but as souls. When clips resurfaced occasionally, They were no longer paired with mockery or sensational captions. Instead, people began sharing them with quiet admiration. "Look how far they've come," one comment read. "They didn't give up." It was a subtle but significant shift from consumption to contemplation. Betty's quiet strength. For Betty, healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about reclaiming her story. She began keeping a small journal, writing only a few lines a day. Most entries were prayers, not for herself but for others, for the people who had hurt her family, for the strangers who had prayed for them, for those who still lived in loneliness and confusion. Her handwriting was uneven, her words simple, but every page was filled with grace. One entry read, "The world watched us fall, but God never stopped holding us." That sentence became something of a personal mantra. Every morning, before sunrise, she would read it aloud, then sit quietly with her coffee and the old family photographs she'd managed to save from the condemned house. Each image was a reminder of the promise she made so many years ago: to protect, to love, to endure. And though the world had changed beyond recognition, that promise still guided her faith and forgiveness. If there's one thing the Whittaker story revealed to those who truly listened, it is that faith is not the absence of pain, it is the strength to carry pain with dignity. Betty's faith had been tested through poverty, isolation, and now global scrutiny, yet she never allowed bitterness to take root. Even when strangers online accused, insulted, or misunderstood, she responded with silence. Not out of defeat, but out of conviction. Patrick once said that Betty forgives faster than most people can apologize. It wasn't that she forgot, she simply chose not to let resentment shape her. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson the world could learn from her, that strength is quiet, forgiveness is radical, and humility is not weakness, but power. In a society obsessed with confrontation and drama, Betty's quiet endurance became a countercultural act of grace. The ripple effect. The Whittakers' recovery story began to inspire new conversations about ethics in digital storytelling. Journalists, documentary filmmakers, and social media creators started citing their case in discussions about privacy, consent, and the moral limits of exposure. In one academic forum, a professor of media studies described the Whittakers as a mirror held up to our culture, a reflection of how easily empathy turns into entertainment. He wasn't wrong. The family's experience had become more than a story about a rural family. It was a lesson about humanity in the digital age. But for the Whittakers, that cultural conversation meant little compared to the simple, day-to-day goal of rebuilding a normal life. Weren't looking for redemption in headlines, they were looking for peace at the dinner table, for laughter to return to their home, for sleep to come without fear. And slowly, those things began to return. Reunion months after the live stream, a quiet reunion took place. Patrick and Eric, after months of silence and mutual resentment, met again, not on camera, but in private. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. There were no speeches, no tears for the public to witness, just two men realizing that the family's pain was greater than their pride. They spoke for hours about misunderstandings, about guilt, about how things spiraled so far out of control. In the end, they agreed on one thing, that the story was never about them, it was about Betty, was about honoring the promise she had carried since childhood. When Betty found out about their meeting, she wept, not from sorrow but from relief. "Maybe," she whispered, "this is the beginning of the end of all this." And perhaps in that quiet reconciliation, something sacred was restored, a testament of hope. The story of the Whittakers will always be remembered for its complexity, the beauty and the brokenness intertwined, but beyond the headlines and the viral clips lies something far more profound. A testament to endurance, compassion, and the possibility of healing even after deep fracture. In one of his last recorded messages, Patrick said, "We can't change what's been done, but we can choose what we do next, and what we're going to do is live. That's what the family wants, to live in peace." And so they did. The family that once lived under the harsh gaze of the world found their way back to something pure and human, the simple rhythm of days unrecorded. They cook, they pray, they laugh, they visit the cemetery where their parents rest and leave flowers, whispering promises that the world will never hear the last frame. If this were a film, it would end not with a speech, but with an image. Betty sitting on the porch of her new home. The sun dipping below the West Virginia hills. Her hands folded in quiet prayer, the light catches her silver hair, and for the first time in a long while, there is peace on her face. She has kept her promise through every storm, through every loss, through every cruel word and fleeting headline. She has remained faithful, and somewhere out there, among the countless faces who watched her story unfold, hearts have been changed. People have learned to look at suffering differently, to listen before judging, to care without consuming. The world will forget many stories, but the Whittakers story, the story of a woman's unwavering love, a family's brokenness, and a quiet faith that refused to die, will endure in the hearts of those who saw beyond the noise, because in the end, this was never about viral fame or controversy. It was about what it means to be human, to fall, to forgive, and to begin again. And for Betty, that beginning has already come. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.